So most of my time in China, I was working for the NBA out of their Shanghai office. Yeah, that was what I was doing. The program I chose was this program that was an immersion program that had a 24-hour language pledge. Like you had to sign a contract saying, like, I will only speak Chinese 24 hours a day for the whole semester.
Here we are on beautiful Jones Street.
You saw Ted Jones.
Sponsored by Stock L Dreamery, the most delicious vegan cheese on the market. We got original smoked paprika and chili, garlic and herbs, and I'll tell you what, guys, this is the best vegan cheese you'll have. Don't forget the cheddar melt. Enjoy the episode.
Do people normally wear the headphones? I don't want to break the continuity of what your podcast normally looks like.
Bro, you can do whatever you want, bro. This is how it normally looks like. Except people will sometimes wear the headphones and sometimes not, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. So
Ben Frank, what's up, buddy?
Okay.
Good to see you, dude.
Good to see you too.
Bro, do you remember that you're probably around the same age as me, right? Like around 30?
Yeah, I'm 34.
Okay, so around the same age. Do you remember that company, Paul Frank?
Yes.
That girls were wearing with the monkeys?
Yes, with the monkeys. Yeah. That was big when I was in like middle school, high school.
What happened to that?
I don't know. It's a good question. I haven't seen it in a really long time.
Yeah.
But people did it. Is be like, oh, Ben Frank, Paul Frank.
Yeah.
It's kind of the
Was
same
that
name.
annoying, or would you kind of like the attention there?
It wasn't annoying because it still kind of paled in comparison to people calling me Benjamin Franklin.
Oh my gosh!
That's always been.
How did I miss that?
Well, it's right there.
Well, I mean, but it's an extenuating of the first and last name, so that'd be a little bit tough.
It is, but people make the leap pretty regularly.
Yeah, but you know what it is? I feel like when you were in school, people probably learned about Benjamin Franklin, and then you were in the class being Ben Frank. Then that's where they would probably. But even still, now people do it.
Even so, well, it didn't help when I was younger. At one point, I went to a school that was named for Benjamin Franklin.
Stop.
From 5th to 7th grade, I was in a school that was named after Benjamin Franklin.
And then that's also probably the time where Paul Frank was really making a big uprising.
Yeah.
You were getting a lot of attention in middle school, it sounds like.
So it was not only named after Benjamin Franklin, it was in the town of Franklin. Yeah. So there's a lot going on there. Going on.
Wait, and you grew up in Jersey?
Massachusetts.
Okay. And when did you move to New York?
I moved to New York about 3 years ago. I previously lived there for a year or two after college.
New York?
Yeah, it's been like two separate stints. In the middle, I lived in China for 7 years. Yeah, so it's a little.
Do you know Mandarin?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I speak Mandarin fluently.
No,
I also teach it. I also tutor it on the side. Yeah.
Wow. And dude, when you were saying tutor, I figured math, English. I would have never thought Chinese. Mandarin.
Well, I mean, why would you? Why would that be
that would be
your
insane.
first thought? You look at me and
That'd be crazy.
Betty's teaching Chinese to those kids.
What's the difference between Mandarin and Chinese? Is Mandarin the language spoken in China?
Well, so Mandarin is the official language of government and business. So Chinese can refer to any of the many Chinese dialects. When people say Chinese, they're usually referring to either Mandarin or Cantonese because those are the two that at least Americans know most, are most familiar with.
Yeah.
But the truth is that basically every province and pretty much every city in China has their own dialect. But Mandarin is because they have so many dialects, Mandarin is the one that they basically decided, okay, this is what we speak in government. This is what we speak in business. If you want to do that, that's the language you have to speak. But most Chinese people, they will speak at least Mandarin plus whatever the dialect is from wherever they're from.
So when you're saying dialect, is that more of some people will speak slang if they're not speaking business terms or?
No, by dialect, I mean, it's a totally different language. So this is the weird thing about Chinese languages is that because they're written in characters, so the written language is universal, but the spoken language is different between these different regions. So that's why, if you go to a movie theater in China, even if the movie is in Chinese, it will always have subtitles because they know everyone can read Chinese, but not everyone might be able to understand whatever dialect is being spoken.
So there's another thing that China started, the subtitles. You guys got the masks they were wearing first. They got the umbrellas in the sun.
Yeah.
And then who knew that they started the subtitles? They got the pencils first.
Yeah, that's been an interesting thing about subtitles is that like when we were growing up, it would be, if there was a video or a movie with subtitles, people would be like, "I'm out. I don't read. I go to the movies to watch some. I don't want to make my brain work." People were like, they would be like, "Oh, there's this great movie I watched. It's 2.5 hours with subtitles." You're like, "Come on."
Yeah, I wonder what the difference is.
Yeah,
why that changed.
I don't know. I think people got used to it. Like with social media, I think people got used to it because they had to watch like with the volume off. Like they just got used to like, oh, I kind of, to know what's going on, I need to be able to read it too, and like to be able to watch covertly, like at work or whatever.
Right.
So I think that kind of changed things. But I remember for years, like pretty much, at least in America, everyone, like if it was a movie with subtitles, people were like, "I'm out. No way, can't do it."
Yeah, definitely. And especially if I were to watch a movie in another language, like German, and then there's subtitles, that's a different story. But like English with subtitles now, I don't even really watch. But there are, given that the TVs are so advanced now, it's sometimes hard to understand what the people are saying because there's so many different forms of audio. You know, like back when we were growing up, you watched Saved by the Bell or you watch Rocket Power, all the audio coming out of the TV sounded the same. Now the audio is so advanced that if you watch movies that have $100 million budgets like Avatar, the audio coming out of the TV is different than it would be for just a regular type of audio show. And each TV has, you have a bar, you have a sound thing. So the audio is so diverse. TVs are different nowadays. But yeah, it's just sometimes the technology has made it more difficult to consume content, I suppose.
Yeah. So I mean, but yeah. So China has been like. So the funny thing is, this was probably this is like a few months after I moved to China. I took a girl on a date to see one of the Planet of the Apes movies. I forget which one it was. It was one of the. I think it was one of the James Franco. It was either Rise or Dawn of the Planet. I forget. Whatever one came out in around 2014, and. So obviously it's a movie. It's an English movie that I'm watching in a theater in Shanghai, but it has the subtitles in Chinese for the Chinese people, and I'm just watching this movie being like, this is easy for me. I just get to listen. I don't have to read anything. Everyone else is having to work really hard. This is fantastic for me. Then what I neglected to remember is this is a Planet of the Apes movie, so there's going to be massive stretches of the film that are spoken in ape, like 8-10 minute stretches where there's no English and it's just apes talking to each other. And for that, you need subtitles. But because we're in China, the subtitles are in Chinese, not in English, like they would be during those scenes if you were watching the movie in America. Yeah. So then all of a sudden when those scenes came up, I'm like, oh man, now I need to actually actively read these Chinese subtitles to understand what's going on in the movie.
Unless you speak ape, that's insane.
Right. So I went from being at a severe advantage to being at a severe disadvantage once the ape scenes came in.
That's hilarious. Okay, how did you get to China and where'd you go to college?
I went to UPenn in Philadelphia.
Okay, nice.
I started studying Chinese there. It was one of those things. They had a 4-semester language requirement, and I was like, if I'm
what'd you take in high school?
In high school, I took Latin.
Damn, bro. So you started off taking a difficult language.
Yeah, I mean, Latin's weird because it is difficult, but it also, you don't have to speak it, which makes it a lot, like, because Latin's not a spoken language. So when you learn Latin in school, like, there's really not much emphasis on speaking it because they know you're never going to speak it in real life. There's no, so it's mostly the reasons, at least in America, that people usually learn Latin are to help their vocabulary in English. A lot of times people be like, oh, it helps you SAT scores.
Yeah.
Because you know more vocabulary.
Right. I got exempt from taking Latin because they thought it was too difficult for some of us. So I got exempt. I didn't have to take it.
So I think I think Latin is hard. Like Latin is basically, it's hard, but it's hard in a different way than a lot of other languages are. Because Latin is basically just memorizing a bunch of tables and charts, because it's about like, oh, this conjugation or this declension or this case, what's the ending? If you can like have these charts in your head and know what the endings are supposed to be, it's not that hard to do. But some people's brains don't work that way. But if you have a brain that can be like, oh, I just have to memorize what's on these charts and I'm kind of good, then it's not that hard. But if you're someone whose brain doesn't work that way, it might be extremely hard.
Why didn't you continue to take Latin at college? Did you, for the most part, get through it in high school?
I mean, I pretty much, like, I think at that point, if I needed to take 4 semesters of a language, I was like, oh, I want to take a language that people actually speak. And so I was like, I'm going to take the one that, like, the most people speak.
But
so
learning a language is notably very difficult when you are older. You know, if you don't start learning a language by the time you're 4 or 5 years old. Was this intimidating to you? And how did you, like, when did you start to pick it up and speak fluently? And were there other class members that actually were good at speaking and writing as well?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always really, it is hard when you start older. I mean, so I was 18 when I started learning it, so that's not young. But what was challenging is that a lot of times, especially when you take those classes, a lot of the people in your class are Chinese. Like they might be Chinese people who already know a little bit of Mandarin, or their parents spoke Cantonese growing up, so they're familiar with another dialect, but they maybe know something that can help them. But honestly, sometimes that can be actually unhelpful, or that can hurt them because they have these built-in habits of pronunciation that actually do them a disservice because they are speaking a different dialect of Chinese where that has totally different pronunciation. So so my pronunciation or my tones would often be better than some of the Chinese kids just because I was a blank slate and they were having to unlearn stuff they'd learned from either Cantonese or another Chinese dialect. So I took it for my first 2 years, and I wasn't particularly, like, I did well in the class, but I wasn't particularly good at speaking it just because you don't have that many opportunities. It's just whenever it comes up in class, and I just wasn't that good at speaking. But then I decided my junior year for a semester, I was going to do a study abroad in Beijing. And the program I chose was this program that was an immersion program that had a 24-hour language pledge. Like, you had to sign a contract saying, like, I will only speak Chinese 24 hours a day for the whole semester. Like, you just basically signed your life away to these.
For how long?
For the whole semester.
How long
like,
is that?
So like 3 or 4 months, like from beginning of September to like mid to end of
Even when you
December.
talk to your parents?
So that was the one carve out, was that if you were in your dorm room and you were like Skyping with your parents, you could obviously speak English, but any interactions in class, any interactions in other interactions in the dorm rooms with either your roommates or other students, anything in the cafeteria, anything going out in the city.
And where was this?
Beijing.
And this was when? During college you went there for a semester?
Yeah, my junior year. This was fall of 2010.
Wow. And I imagine that must have helped dramatically.
Yeah, so that was basically.
Did you start to think in Chinese and dream in Chinese?
I don't know to what degree I dreamt.
Yo, let me get the dumplings.
Was that guy Jamaican?
He was Jamaican, but he was thinking in Chinese, thinking in Chinese food.
But I don't know to what degree I've ever dreamt in Chinese, but I've definitely thought in Chinese to the extent where I've had situations where I've been in the mode of speaking Chinese and then a thought comes to me and I'm like, this would be easier to say in Chinese than English. Or like, I can more conveniently or more efficiently express this in Chinese than English. And not that I'm struggling to find the English words, but I'm just like, oh, this is a little more clunky in English.
Yeah.
To express this.
So you've been speaking Chinese now for 16 years?
Yeah, basically.
And almost the same amount of time that you spoke English.
I guess spoke English before I started learning Chinese. Yeah, I guess.
You ever think about it like that?
A little bit. Yeah, I mean, it does sometimes. It is a little crazy to me sometimes when I think about it.
Okay, but you speak fluent in Chinese. And how many, when people say that there are thousands of characters, like Chinese characters, how many are there actually? Can you put a number on it?
So in terms of ones that are commonly used to like in, basic, speech or basic writing, I would say maybe 2,000 to 5,000, somewhere in that range. But if you're looking at like the whole everything, I would have to look up the updated number, but it could easily be 10, 20,000. But I would say most of those, I would say if we're saying like 20,000, I would say like 75% of those are ones that are not going to be used. If you know, because basically in this would have been 2015. I took what's called the HSK, which is the kind of the Mandarin proficiency test, like for non-native speakers. And at that point it went up, it was like 6 levels of tests. Like you could take 1 to 6, 6 being the hardest and having the most. I, at that point, chose to take the 5 because the 6, in addition to having a lot of characters, it has like a lot of things like Chinese historical allusions and things like that. You need to know a lot more about Chinese history and culture and not just like the language.
The Zhang dynasty and shit.
Yeah, so with these levels of the test, like the amount of characters you need to be familiar with to take the test, like basically
To know the origin of it, maybe.
basically doubles. So like for the level 1, it's not that hard. You only needed to know like 150 characters. It's not much. And then level 2 doubles, you got to know 300. Level 3 doubles from that, you got to know 600. Level 4 doubles from that, you got to know 1200. Then for level 5, you needed to know 2500, or be at least you could be tested on up to 2500. So that was the level that I took. Now, I don't think I know 2500 characters probably, but I was able to do well on a test where I could have been quizzed on that many.
Why did you end up taking that test, though?
I took it because at the time I was in the market, like I was in the job market in China. I was looking for another job and I had some time on my hands. And I also thought, oh, this could just be a useful thing in the job hunt to prove that I'm good at Chinese. I mean, later on, it's actually what I realized later is that you really only need it for sure if you're applying to like a Chinese university to be a student. That's when you really need it. If you're applying for a job, they can basically tell if they interview you in Chinese how good your Chinese is. Right. But I thought it would be helpful to have on a resume to be like, hey, I passed this level of the HSK. This shows what my Chinese level is.
When did you realize that you wanted to start to look for jobs in China and move to China and embrace the culture like that? Like, how old were you? Was it like the senior year in college or what?
So, I mean, when
I guess it was after you were probably there.
Yeah, when I studied abroad, and it was just kind of a taste that semester, because I was someone who, like, I had never really, with the exception of maybe once or twice, I had never really, like, left the country in my whole life. Like, up to when I was 20 years old, I basically had stayed in the U.S. the entire time. So I went from, like, almost never having left the country to then living in Beijing for a semester and being forced to speak Chinese the whole time. So it was like a huge change, and obviously opened up a whole new world. And I was like, oh, it might be cool to come back here and live here, like as an adult, like a working adult. That could be cool. So I graduated from college. I moved to New York. Was in New York for like a year. I was working in consulting, but I was looking for other jobs because consulting I was making decent money, but it's not the most fulfilling career. And I saw this job posting on a job board that I looked at sometimes, that it was like a special assistant to the CEO of a real estate investment company. So I was like, well, I'll apply to that, see what happens. So it's basically a real estate investment company that was based primarily out of Hong Kong and Tokyo. So I applied to that. Then they basically did a virtual interview with me for the first round. And then they wanted to see more of me. So they flew me out to Tokyo for an interview.
In Japan?
Yeah. So I was living in New York. They flew me out to Tokyo for an interview. So this is also weird because the interview was in the middle of the week. It was like on a Wednesday. So I had to take off a Tuesday through Thursday at a consulting job where it's hard to take time off. And I had to think of some excuse for why I needed to take it off a Tuesday through Thursday. So I basically left work a little early on Monday, took an evening flight, from JFK to Tokyo that landed in Tokyo Tuesday night, did my interview Wednesday, then flew out sometime probably Thursday afternoon, got back in New York, because of the time change. When you fly from Tokyo back to America, you basically usually will get back around the same time you left. So I got back Thursday evening to New York, then went to work again on Friday. So it was crazy. So I did that interview. Then they eventually offered me the job. So I first moved out to basically Hong Kong and Tokyo, but I didn't have an apartment at that time because my boss basically traveled all the time and it was just my job to follow him around wherever he went. And so it didn't make sense for me to have an apartment because I was never in one place for more than like a little bit of time. So my residence at the time where I was based was technically Hong Kong, but I was almost never there, or I was rarely there. So it didn't make sense for me to have an apartment. So in Hong Kong, I was responsible eventually for finding my own accommodation, but that only happened on like 1 or 2 trips. And then anywhere else, they were putting me up. So like,
like in a hotel?
yeah. So in Tokyo, depending on how long the stay was, they either put me up in a hotel or like a serviced apartment. So being able to stay in places like that in Tokyo, with that I didn't have to pay for, and also being able to expense meals up to a certain point. I mean, I was just getting sushi all the time, and just being like, oh yeah, I'll expense that. Just and
How long did you work for this guy? This particular guy?
fortunately, didn't last long. I wasn't that great at the job, and also he was one of those very high maintenance CEOs, one of those very like insane mad genius CEOs.
What was a weird request that he?
Well, it wasn't necessarily, it was one of those things where he was a very unusual man and just kind of expected you to be able to read his mind. When like literally his vice president, or his number 2 in the company, was basically a childhood friend of his that he had known since he was 6. So they'd known each other for like 40 plus years. And this guy was basically like, yeah, I don't know what he'd be like. I don't know what Bill wants all the time. It's like, this guy knows him better than anybody. It's like, I can't read his mind. And even the number 2 at the company, he'd be like, even if we're going to the same place, he's like, I never travel with Bill. It's like, it's too stressful. He's always late. So even if they were going on the same flight to go to the same place, take his own car, be like, because Bill, that was the other thing. Bill would always cut things really close to the airport. But because he was someone who was rich and flew a lot, he just had he had access to everything at all the lounges. He could cut every line. So one time we were flying out of Hong Kong. So basically it's an international flight wherever you're going out of Hong Kong. There's no such thing as a domestic flight there. But so we're flying, I forget where we were flying to. We might have been, I forget. Anyways, it's an international flight out of Hong Kong.
So how long was the flight, if you remember that?
I forget where we were going, because if we were going back to Tokyo, it just would have been like 4 hours, but we might have been flying to Europe, so it could have been like 10 or 12 hours. I forget which flight this was, but I remember there was one flight where we were flying out of Hong Kong, international flight. We show up to the airport no more than 40 minutes before the departure time. At most, it was 40. Could have been less. At most, it was 40. But of course, we go up, cut every line, check in, we cut through, and because you don't just got to go through security, you got to go through immigration. That smooth. We walked through. I don't think we even ran to the gate. It was, we got through everything so quickly, and he was just never bothered, never in a rush. But of course, I'm having heart palpitations.
Where do you sit on those flights?
Oh, I'm in coach. He's in first class. And yeah, so I would be also, the other thing about him was, since he was, I'd be curious if a lot of business people still do this. I'm sure a lot of them do, but he was of the mindset, because he traveled everywhere, was constantly in transit. And we would run into people that when you were traveling, you always needed to be dressed nice, always need to be suited up, because he's like, you never know who you're going to run into when you're in the airport or when you're in transit. You always need to be looking and acting your best.
You hear that?
So I would be going on like these 12-hour flights in like a full suit, which just is so uncomfortable. It's just, yeah.
And it's also, I think it's also an American mindset too. Like, you never really see that in America. You always see people in like their most comfy outfits.
Yeah. I don't know if business traveler, there might be some business travelers in America that go by that rule, but it was very much a thing for him. So I always needed to be suited up whenever we were traveling, or just at least dressed very nice.
How long did you work for him?
It was like 4 or 5 months.
And then,
but I went so many places.
That's sick.
We traveled in that short amount of time. The amount of places I traveled with him, I spent significant time in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, went to Taiwan, spent a little bit of time in New York here, LA and Orange County. I went to London Frankfurt, Israel, and Hawaii.
Dope.
All in I mean, you just.
But when you were with him though, do you really have time to take a second to breathe, or maybe you'd have a couple hours here and there to embrace the scene, the scenery?
Yeah, I mean, it was mostly all my days would revolve around his needs and if he needed me. So I needed to constantly be on call. So ironically, the times when I got to enjoy myself the most were probably
when you were with him.
With him.
Yeah.
Like if we were
On
having
the
a meal
beach
or
or
doing
some shit.
sightseeing that he wanted to do, because then I at least knew that he wasn't going to need me for something else.
Right.
Or if I do remember there was one time when we were in Frankfurt, we drove to this little town called, I think it was called like Wiesbaden or something like that, because there was a bank there that he wanted to meet with someone at that bank. So basically, we got dropped off, and he had his meeting, and I just kind of walked around and enjoyed the town. So that was kind of cool. That was kind of cool for me. I just walked around.
It was a nice hour.
Yeah, ate a little schnitzel. It was, yeah. So you would have these moments here or there, but having to be at someone's beck and call all the time,
sure it's tough.
Is pretty exhausting. And I wasn't cut out for it, and I wasn't good at anticipating his needs. And he also wasn't good at giving feedback for the things I did wrong and being like, oh, hey, next time, like, I would like if you do it this way. He wasn't that good at that. So basically what happened was, we were doing stuff, and then I remember there was this one day. So I basically started working for him in October. And then this was in like around mid-February. I think I remember the date exactly. It was February 17th, 2014. We were in Hong Kong, and I was working in their office there. And so where he stayed in Hong Kong, he stayed at the Four Seasons residences. So a lot of the Four Seasons or things like that, they'll have the hotel, but then they'll have a separate part that's residences. That's like long-term. People either own the property, just long-term stays. So he stayed at the Four Seasons residences. So he was like, hey, have some documents. Could you bring me some documents in the lobby of the Four Seasons residences? So I got the documents together in the office. I walked over the lobby of the Four Seasons residences. We sit on the couch, and he starts talking to me, and he basically goes, I need to make a change. And he basically just tells me that it's not working, and I'm fired. And especially since this was a job that I quit my job in consulting for and moved all the way across the world for this job. And the recruiting process or interview process of this job took like 6 or 7 months. And then I ended up only working for them for 4 or 5 months. Like, he pulled the trigger really quickly and didn't really make an effort to try to make it work. I think he was just like, no, this isn't working. And then it was over. And all of a sudden I had to think about where I was going. And then I kind of came back to New York and tried to figure things out and figure out what the next move was. Luckily, because he fired me so quickly and unceremoniously, I did get a nice severance that they offered me. So they gave me 6 months severance, which was pretty good.
Do you mind talking about how much you made back then?
I mean, it was good money for someone right out of college.
Yeah.
I think I was probably, this was 2013. I think my base salary was maybe $70K.
As a 23-year-old?
Yeah.
Damn. All right, so that's very good. And you also weren't spending really any money when you were over there.
Well, yeah, especially, yes, I was able to expense almost everything. He was paying for meals that we were, yeah. So
he was like, here's $20, go get us some sushi. Keep
right.
it there, but maybe it's probably more than that, but then maybe you kept the change.
But yeah, I didn't have an apartment. So yeah, you're right. During that time, I was spending very little of my own money.
Right.
And was making that. I mean, I don't know had I stayed there longer, how the salary would have gone up or what sort of bonuses I would have gotten.
And that's probably like adjusted to today's inflation. That's got to be $100K maybe. Close to it.
Might be. Yeah, I would have to look at it. But no, I mean, especially for someone just out of college, it was, it was good.
Sure.
It's good
and
money.
Did you feel like your Chinese was improving day over day, or you were pretty locked in at that point?
Well, for that job specifically, I didn't actually get to use my Chinese that much because so a lot of the time we were in Tokyo, so obviously I'm not using my Chinese there. But in Hong Kong, they speak English and Cantonese, so you can't really use your Mandarin there. People actually get really defensive and really angry at you for speaking Mandarin.
What?
In Hong Kong.
So what language were you speaking with Bill?
So Bill was American. I spoke English with him.
No way.
So this guy was a crazy mad genius. He's American from, I think he was from New York. Like
This whole time we thought Bill was a Chinese guy.
you did. I never said that.
They probably thought
you
too.
made an assumption.
That's true. I was assuming his race.
Yeah. No, Bill was a white guy from New York, but he spoke Mandarin fluently, he spoke Japanese fluently, and he was conversational in Cantonese. And he built like a real estate investment, like private equity firm in Asia from like the ground up, and was just really locked. One of those guys is like, those people who are just really locked into the economic cycles and just instinctively know when things are about to bottom out or when things are about to kind of skyrocket.
Sure.
He was locked in that way. So just kind of a genius in that capacity, but also eccentric and a total mess, as many geniuses are.
Right.
So so I didn't get to speak a whole lot of Mandarin. Really, the only Mandarin I think I got to speak during that job was when we went to Taiwan, because a lot of people speak Mandarin there. But so I came back to New York. At the time, I also had a girlfriend that I had been doing long distance with across the world.
Where does she live? Massachusetts?
She lived in New York. So
she went to Penn with you?
No. She went to Fordham. We met on a trip to Europe that I went on right after graduation. And then we ended up both living in New York, so we stayed together and started a relationship. This is actually a crazy thing. So I went on that trip with my best friend from college, and then about a couple weeks before that, his best friend, my best friend from college, his best friend from high school, went on a similar Europe trip. He wasn't with us, but went on a similar Europe trip. So I got into a 2-year relationship with a girl I met on that trip. Those two are both married to women they met on those Europe trips.
So you were almost the third.
I was almost the third. What are they? I feel like they need to advertise that.
Yeah, they got to do stand up.
Yeah,
That's what they should do.
well, no, I'm saying the tour companies need to advertise that. It's like, meet your husband, meet your wife.
Right. That's like imagine that was a birthright trip. That'd be all on the front page.
Right.
Birthright Israel.
Exactly.
Side note, do you ever go on Birthright?
I did.
Me too.
Yeah.
I mean, like 7 years ago. I remember on the time, just to interject here quickly. I remember on the time, like when I was on it, I was like, this is the most laborious trip of all time. They've got you up at 7 a.m. They'll put you to bed at 11 p.m. But the entire time you're in the sun, hiking Masada, doing everything Jewish, a lot of propaganda. And I remember on the trip, I was like, this is so bad right now. Like, it's so difficult. But, looking back on it, I knew that it was going to be happy that I went. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. You know exactly.
Okay, so I want to talk about, you came back to New York. You worked in New York, I guess you were saying, then for another year and another few months, and then went back to Beijing.
So I basically took a few months to figure out what I wanted to do. I started applying for jobs both in and around New York, but also jobs in China, because I was like, at that point, I'm basically 2 years out of college. I've been unemployed for several months. I'm trying to figure out what my next move is and how things are going to go. I don't know if my best job opportunity is going to be in America or going to be in China. And I basically had like one final round interview, I think, at some private equity company real estate private equity company in New Jersey that I didn't get. But other than that, all of like the interviews and the traction I was getting was for jobs I was applying for in China. Like I was, even living in New York, I was just getting like more traction. And then, so there was this job that I found. It was for a real estate developer in Shanghai. And, I applied for that job while I was living here, did all the interviews virtually. And they offered me the job, and I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll move to Shanghai. And so that was basically, I took that job, moved to Shanghai end of July 2014, and stayed there for 7 years.
Damn, bro.
Yeah.
You've got an interesting story, huh?
It's not typical. It's a little
That's
different.
the beautiful thing about the podcast, guys, is, we have so many comedians on here on the couch. And when we're not talking about comedy, you learn so much about them. It's really a beautiful thing. When did you start? Did you start comedy in China?
I did.
And do you have bits about were you American there, or you were doing Chinese comedy? How'd that look? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was doing mostly English comedy there. I did some Chinese comedy. The weird thing is I actually have done more shows in Chinese since I moved back to New York than I did while I was living in China.
And where do you do those Chinese shows in New York?
A lot of them, there's a group that puts together shows, and a lot of them end up being at St. Mark's.
Okay.
So I've done quite a few there, but most of the shows I did in China were in English. So I started there there was a club in Shanghai. There are actually a couple clubs in Shanghai at that time, and I started doing open mics at one of them. Then eventually got on weekend showcases. Then you start to explore doing the road in Asia, figuring out what the expat scene, like what expat scenes have comedy, and slowly kind of going on the road in China, headlining around China, then eventually headlining around Asia.
How were the turnouts for those shows?
I mean, usually pretty good, because the thing is, it's almost like if you think about when you go, like if you go and do like headline in a small town in America, a lot of times it's a small town, but
everybody's coming out.
You're the only thing happening.
Right.
That's kind of what it was like in smaller cities in China, because in places like Shanghai and Beijing, you have a lot of expats, but it's such a big city, there's so much to do. Whereas if you go to these smaller cities, there are way fewer expats, but there is nothing to do. So if there's one like foreign type thing, non-Chinese thing that they can find to do on a weekend, they'd be like, "Dude, we're going to that." So the shows would often be good. I mean, honestly, a lot of times when you go to the smaller cities, the people you find who live there are strange people. Because there's a difference even between expats who live in China in the big cities versus the ones who live in the small cities. Because there's just a matter of like the people who live in the small cities, you're just like, okay, you moved all the way to China, but you moved all the way to China to live way out here.
Yeah, interesting.
Like, who are you running from?
Right.
Or like, sometimes also those people might have gotten chased out of the bigger cities. Like they had something, either legal trouble or a job that fired them, or like their reputation went bad in a bigger city, so they moved to a smaller city.
When you were over there, what else were you doing though besides stand-up comedy for those? So you had a 7-year stint after you were working for Bill?
Yes.
Okay. And what were you doing there?
So most of my time in China, I was working for the NBA out of their Shanghai office. Yeah. That was what I was doing. Yeah. Looking at the camera. You can't believe it. This guy can't believe it.
Yeah. What?
Yeah. So basically the story is here. I worked for that real estate developer about 3 or 4 months after I started working for them. That company basically, it was a subsidiary it was a retail mall developing subsidiary of this big Chinese company that everyone in China knows. And basically the parent company pulled the plug on the subsidiary. And so everybody lost their job. So I basically, once again, moved across the world, and like 4 months later, I'm out of a job. But this time I was like, I'm staying in China. I'll find another job in China. It took me a while. I was originally just looking for other real estate jobs. And I had actually signed on to work for JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle, and like their research team in Shanghai. I was going to work for them. And I had basically like already agreed. I think I'd already signed a contract. I had my start date was in like 5 days. It was like, I think it was like a Wednesday, and I was going to be starting the following Monday. And I got this email from this guy that I hadn't talked to in like 2 or 3 years, who is a headhunter specializing in placing bilingual foreigners in jobs in China. That was kind of he like started his own company and like doing that. That was kind of his thing. And we had met like once in like 2012, and now it's like 2015. Hadn't talked to this guy in years. This guy didn't even know that I'm looking for a job. And he basically sends me an email that's like, I have this job, and you're the first person I thought of. Which is like, again, crazy. It's not like I don't have a regular relationship. I'm not like a great friend of this person. I met him once. We've maybe stayed in contact.
But he knows you speak Chinese. You could chop it up in Chinese.
Yeah. So, but I'm like, I'm actually starting a job in 5 days. I really can't entertain this. And he's like, let's just have a call. So I was like, okay. So then we have a call, and he goes, the job is with the NBA. And I'm like, okay, well, I mean, I've always been a huge sports fan. I've always loved the NBA. I'd always wanted to work in sports, and I'd always wanted to work in China. So the idea of working in sports in China, then I'm like, oh, boy. What? So then I start thinking, can we actually make this work? I'm starting this job in 5 days. I'm like, there's no way you can get me through the interview process and get me a potential job offer before this job starts. Like, it's an impossibility. So I'm like, how much time would you need to get me through the interview process to see if I would get this job? And he's like, 2 weeks. So then basically I called or sent a message to Jones Lang LaSalle, was basically thought of an excuse for why I needed to delay my start date.
Yeah, you like I can't pass the drug test right now.
I was like, oh, I got to go visit family before I start. I said something.
Yeah.
And so they basically, the NBA got me through 3 interviews in 2 weeks. My first interview was a lunch interview with the guy who would eventually become my supervisor, my boss, an American guy. So that was pretty chill. We talked to him. It was good. That went well. The second interview was with HR. That one was entirely in Chinese. So that interview went fine. Then my final interview was with the number 2 at NBA China, like the senior, like executive vice president, only guy, basically the CEO of NBA China is the only person above him. And that interview was in the lobby of the Westin Hotel in Shanghai. It was probably about 65% Chinese, 35% English. We went back and forth. And then they offered me the job. And I took it, and then I basically, on that Monday, just didn't show up to JLL for what they thought was going to be my first day.
Now, you worked at the NBA China for 7 years?
About five and a half.
What was the highlight, and then how did you transition to moving back to New York after that?
So, I mean, a lot of cool things. I mean, so I was responsible for helping to develop and operate some NBA-themed children's play zones in China, basically basketball-themed indoor playgrounds. So I would go to malls around China and just meet with Chinese landlords and just try to negotiate with them and try to figure out if we could see if the space was suitable, but also see if we could come to commercial terms that would be amenable to us. So I got to travel a lot to different cities in China, sometimes pretty small cities. And yeah, it was just, it was literally, it would be these Chinese landlords, sometimes working for big developers. And then I would be across the table as the representative from the NBA doing these, like negotiating with them and trying to figure out how to make this stuff work. And so that was cool. And I got to meet a bunch of NBA players when they would come over to China, either in the summer. Some would help us with our, like when we had openings, like for the opening of the first one in Shanghai, we were able to get Tracy McGrady. He was in town for that.
Are you tight with any of these guys still?
No,
it was more just like a business relationship.
Yeah, that's kind of what you realize when you're in that world and the players come through, is that like the players were all like really nice, but you do realize it is a business arrangement. It is an appearance. Like it does, for the most part, start and end them there.
Right.
You don't really have a relationship with them after that. For the most part, it would kind of be unusual. Unless you saw them and worked with them regularly in an ongoing fashion, then maybe.
Right.
But I
hang
was
out in New York or something. Whatever.
Yeah, I was never in that position with any of them.
What was your transition like out of that job and coming back to the United States?
Yeah, so basically, like during the pandemic, the part of the business that I worked for was being sold off to another company because of the pandemic and some of the stuff happening with the NBA in China. Because their business hurt a lot. Because I don't know if you remember this in like 2019, Daryl Morey, who at the time was the GM of the Houston Rockets, either retweeted or just tweeted this like "I stand with Hong Kong" thing, and it just literally ruined the NBA's relationship with China.
And why was that? Describe that.
So basically, it ruined the relationship because mainland China and Hong Kong have this very, very contentious relationship that came from. Because Hong Kong was a British colony that was returned to China in 1997. But basically, as part of the return, there were stipulations put into place where the Hong Kong people were able to keep their system of government because they had a more, like, basically a democracy or a more democratic system of government because of the British influence. But obviously China is communist. So there was basically these measures put into place where Hong Kong was able to keep their own political system, even though they were now a part of China. So literally the phrase or how it works, it's called one country, two systems. So Hong Kong basically had their own government, but the idea was that Hong Kong would eventually, within 50 years, by 2047, would be totally reabsorbed back into China. But the problem is China has tried to accelerate that process, and that is what caused a lot of the protests that happened in Hong Kong in 2018, 2019, was China exercising more control.
Yeah, and a general manager of a big team like the Houston Rockets saying that caused a lot of controversy just because somebody was outspoken about it, not just because it was him in particular, right?
Not just because it was him, but it didn't help because basically the Rockets have always been one of, if not the most popular teams in China because of Yao Ming. So the fact that one of their most the visible and popular teams, and
the Tracy McGrady theoretically,
right. So the fact that basically, and Daryl Morey is someone who's always been out in public and is very talkative and is like a well-known front office figure. The fact that he said that, and the fact that he was representing that team, and it was basically China, like, this was the beginning of the fiscal year for NBA China. Basically, all of their partners and sponsors in China pulled out, almost like immediately. Like any revenue targets or anything they had for that year, the whole year was shot. Like the first week of the year.
That's insane that he had that much influence.
Yeah, because
it's such a contentious political situation, I'm sure.
Right, and Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, was put in a really tough spot because obviously he has a lot of business interests in China to protect, but also has the corporate and American values that the company runs under. And so basically what he had to say was basically be like, we want to continue doing business in China. Our employees, are all entitled to free speech or something like that. He had to couch it. And of course, no matter, it got to the point where both what he said and what LeBron said or what a lot of people said, it was not good enough for either side, because if you're from the China perspective, you're like, people are like, they can't say that. How dare they try to do business with us and then say this about Hong Kong? And then Americans were like, they needed to come out stronger. They should have just totally pulled out of China for China trying to do that. So neither side was really satisfied with how it unfolded. Both thought that kind of the NBA and Adam Silver and LeBron James kind of just folded to the pressure. But it's
and this is around the time that the part of your company just got dissolved where you were at.
Yeah, so this happened in October 2019. Then the pandemic happens. So the NBA's business in China is really suffering at that point. That was quite the 1-2 punch. So they were looking for some liquidity. So the part of the business that I was working at was getting sold off, and the new owners weren't going to renew my contract. And this was like the end of 2020. And I had originally planned to move back to New York. I wanted to move back to New York to do comedy, and I was planning on moving back in summer 2020, but because of the pandemic, I stayed an extra year in China because there was nothing going on here. It wouldn't have made any sense for me to move back. So I thought, because in China, I was living fairly normally during the pandemic. I was able to do comedy. I was able to make money doing my job. So I stayed an extra year. So now, like, I just kind of had to kill some time until summer 2021 when I figured things would be coming back more, and then I could make my move back here. So that was kind of the story of how that unfolded.
That's crazy, man. You've had quite the journey.
Yeah. Well, and who knows? Hopefully
Do people know about this? I mean, I'm sure you probably touch on this on your special, correct?
So on my special, which
go ahead, plug it, man.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not going to be great timing because it's not out yet.
Okay.
It's still editing, but it's going to be out sometime in August.
All right, love it, bro.
On YouTube. It's going to be called Let Me Be Frank.
Love it. Getting back, looping back to the beginning of the episode, bro. I love it.
Yeah.
Talking Frank and shit like that.
So by the time this is out, or a few weeks after this is out, just look up "Let Me Be Frank," Ben Frank on YouTube. It'll be there. In that special, I do talk a bit about my transition in terms of moving back from China, teaching Chinese, speaking Chinese. So I do talk, and I talk about racial issues, and some of the issues I talk about with respect to kind of a more American lens, which would be traditionally kind of white, black racial issues. But then I talk some things where it's more like white Asian or white Chinese.
And also working for the NBA too. I mean, you probably dealt with white, black, and then Asian, and then all different cultures.
So I discussed it. I discussed it a little bit in the special. I mean, it's funny because I feel it's one of those things where I feel like I talk about it a lot, and I'm conscious of not wanting to talk about it too much because I don't want to be that guy that's like, yeah, I used to live in China. I don't.
And after we're all listening to this, we're like, well, yeah, the guy who lived in China, he did.
Yeah. So I don't. It's one of those things I don't want to cram it down people's throats,
right.
But it'll be funny because I feel like I talk about it a lot. So there will sometimes be people or comedians in the city that I feel like I know fairly well. We've had a lot of conversations. I had no idea that you didn't know that about me. Not that it's not like oh, how could you not know that about me? It's like, I feel like you knew enough about me where I just assumed you would have found that out at some point.
Yeah.
So, but I had the same conversation with another comic like a few days ago, or I just kind of mentioned it. I'm like, yeah, then I lived in China for 7 years, and he's like, what did you say? I'm like, oh, you didn't know that?
Stint.
And maybe it comes off even more dickish, being like, you should have known. But
bro, no, this is great. You're truly a great podcaster, man. The story and from start to finish, and I'm sure everybody watching and listening would agree.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad we were able to.
This is great, dude.
We were able to get into it.
Malleable. I got to figure out how to pronounce that word. But Ben Frank, wait, say it. How is it?
I think it's malleable.
Well, we'll trust you. You went to an Ivy League school. Before we get out of here, we're gonna pop up your Instagram. Let us know where we can find you, and this will be up this Thursday coming up. So in like 6 days, if you have any shows or anything coming up, please go ahead.
Yeah, follow me on Instagram at Ben Frank Comedy. Also, when the special comes out, the special Let Me Be Frank, I'll have a link to it there. Or if you want to go directly to YouTube, search Let Me Be Frank, Ben Frank on YouTube. It'll be there at some point in the future when this comes out. Let's see, in terms of shows, by the time this comes out, I'm actually going to be out of town the next 2 weekends. So if anyone lives, when did you say this is going on?
A week from today.
A week from today?
Yeah.
Okay. If anyone listens to this really quickly and will be in Lincolnton, North Carolina, or Charleston, South Carolina, you can come see me there. And then
links in your Instagram bio for more.
Yeah, links in the Instagram bio for more. But it's the chances of you having I don't know, maybe you have a huge listener base in like Charlotte, in that area, that just
North Carolina peeps. You better get along to Ben Frank's show. All right.
Well, not only do they have to listen right when it comes out and be like, oh, I'm going to go there tonight.
All right. So, dude, I mean, there you go. You post it, and then we'll get them out to the show. But, Ben, thank you so much. Please pose for the thumbnail. Smile quick. Amazing. Dude, thanks so much for coming on. This is really a great episode. I learned a lot about you, and I also learned about the culture and language of the Chinese people.
Yeah. Well, Ted, thanks for having me. I had a great time. This was really, really enjoyable.
This is great. Guys, thanks for listening and watching. We'll see you next time. Peace.